I want to talk about a section of Peter Sloterdijk's book, You Must Change Your Life. And this book is roughly based around a section of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which states that the human being is something which walks the tightrope between animals and gods. We stand there in the middle between the two. And our lives are often determined by how far to each end we might go, a fall or a height. And so this is a section which is titled Height Psychology. And the main point of this particular passage is a discussion of a section of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which deals with the issue of reproduction, human reproduction, propagation. The section is called The Doctrine of Upward Propagation and the Meaning of Over. Marriage from an evolutionary perspective. Now remember, we're not dealing with eugenics here. We're not dealing with a higher form of breeding or something that you might see in Nazi ideology. We're dealing with what Sloterdijk refers as ascetic training. This is the quote from Zarathustra, which I'll read first, and then I will read Sloterdijk's interpretation of it. Quote, I have a question for you alone, my brother. I cast this question like a sounding lead into your soul, that I may know how deep it is. You are young and wish for a child and marriage, but I ask you now, are you a human being with the right to wish for a child? Are you the victor, the self-compeller, commander of the senses, master of the virtues? Thus I ask you. Or is it the beast and dire need that speak out of your wish, or isolation, or discord with yourself? I would that your victory and your freedom might yearn for a child. Living monuments shall you build to your victory and your liberation. Over and beyond yourself shall you build. But first you must be built yourself, foursquare in body and soul. Not only onwards shall you propagate yourself, but upwards. May the garden of marriage help you do so. A higher body shall you create, a first movement, a self-propelling wheel, a creator you shall create. Marriage, thus I called the will of two to create the one that is more than those who created it. This is Sloterdijk's interpretation of that passage. Quote, from the perspective of the new procreation trainer, every marriage must be considered a misalliance brought about simply by natural automatism or the social mechanics of the desire for children. Because the man, as Nietzsche presumed to know, had thus far been merely a means to a child for the, quote, real woman, this well-trained female sympathizer and duped fulfiller of feminine wishes must in future be assisted by an advisor who will encourage him to look out for other women, ones on an equal footing who do not want to make the husband the, quote, maid of the woman, but rather form a partnership for the pursuit of nobler aims. It should not unsettle us that the primary goal of better marital partnerships is defined a few verses later with the politically and mass culturally charged term Ubermensch, end quote. Sloterdijk then goes on to explain that this is not a eugenicist argument. Quote, everything else falls under training, discipline, education, and self-design. The Ubermensch implies not a biological but an artistic, not to say acrobatic, program. The only thought-provoking aspect of the marriage recommendations quoted above is the difference between onward and upward propagation. This coincides with a critique of mere repetition. Obviously, it will no longer suffice in the future for children, as one says, to return in their children. There may be a right to imperfection, but not to triviality, end quote. This interpretation of Nietzsche by Sloterdijk inside his speculations on a height psychology and a role of human beings walking this tightrope between gods and animals It also brings up the topic of roles or role models. It brings this up in all of its ontological messiness. For example, presidents, fathers, masters, kings, or anything else that invokes upward admiration. We are beginning to see that the death of God has had gargantuan consequences for the role of these upward embodiments, we can call them, in particular the role of the father. Rather than a so-called absent father figure popularized mainly by actually American television shows and movies, we could actually be dealing with the overbearingness of the mother's handmaiden in a paternalistic form. There are many institutional and cultural examples of this inspirationally sterilized second-rate domestic helper, but that is likely enough for another video. The main point I want to make out here is that when we posit a social role, especially when there's a tension between, say, child, adult, developed, underdeveloped, slave, master, you can think of Hegel's dialectic there, we are dealing with something which has symbolic conditions and expectations underwriting it. Rather than a vulgar politicization over patriarchy from a kind of progressive point of view, or a nihilistic nostalgia for a return to tradition, which usually just means the aesthetic and economic return to some idealized state stripped of its political and ethical potency. For example, my criticism of conservatives or the right here would be that could you actually imagine any of these people demanding a return to tradition in the form of positing a political program where, for example, we all actually believe in God again, only men inherit property, only men occupy political hierarchies, return to full gender segregations, introduce some sort of martial culture, and so on. I think this task would be well beyond. I'm not saying this is what we should do. I'm just saying that many do respond with implying that this is where we should go. But I think that this task would be so beyond even the most clicked on internet reactionaries. Nothing really exists outside of bourgeois parliamentary politics, which goes beyond an aesthetic, nostalgic project or online spaces that occupy the kind of self-pitying niche of the media market. I don't see any of these fashionable reactions really taking this issue seriously, just like the left is continuously positing the existence of a traditional society or a patriarchy which doesn't exist. They both lead to phantasms, basically, these imaginary states, which don't correspond really to anything real. This is probably because both sides are actually ignoring the issue. It's not an issue of an absent or present role or authority, but rather the symbolic conditions of an authority and what those symbolic conditions actually demand. Remember, in Nietzsche, we killed God. We didn't misplace him, nor did he go out one day to get some engine coolant for the lawnmower and just not return. We killed him. Just to make a literary connection here, or a cinematic connection, it was actually Fight Club who I think tackled this problem better than most sociologists or philosophers have in recent times. There's this one quote which states,
"Our fathers were models for God. If our fathers failed, what does that tell you about God?"
This obvious connection between paternal authority and the seismic existential death of God shouldn't be seen as merely fathers who are, for example, in jail, work too much, dead, have other families, and so on. Rather, the social and ethical leadership role, the embodiment of a higher self-design, has been willfully destroyed by those who have no interest, courage to carry it out, or see no profit in the value of a height psychology with the necessary modeling dynamics for those looking to climb the tightrope between animals and gods. There are those with ideological, political, and economic interests in keeping this role in its maiden form, which also means bastardizing all of us for eternity, particularly when the 21st century term for maiden has been cleverly retranslated to provider, or as the rhetoric of Twitter likes to say, cuck. This should give us pause when addressing the issues of, for example, dating apps or self-help complexes, which admittedly rather cheap interpretations of libidinal attraction and how it operates, being directed by some lobster analogized natural hierarchy. Upward propagation in Sloterdijk's terms and Nietzsche's terms doesn't refer to some bourgeois career games played inside a neurotic Western middle class who's replaced heroic vitality with dental insurance and middle management roles with impressive stock options. It refers to the entirely symbolic embodiment of the question of what to be and how to live, or in a more Nietzschean terms, the continuous quest for a higher state of being, which has a kind of generational component to it. This is not to mention the relativity of so-called living standards, of which Homo economicus is so stuck inside of. These living standards are always driven somewhat by voyeuristically envying what your neighbor has. I think we can all agree that detaching our libidinal energies from the chronically dissatisfied and overly medicalized world of the housewives of Orange County, for example, is probably a good idea. To summarize, if we want to truly stop being last men, we should take up the ascetic task laid out in Nietzsche's advice and learn how to give a higher form to the ends of our desires.